to the history of Christianity. Last time we looked at the missions movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, and today we are now going to move into the United States, and we're going to look at Protestantism in the United States. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to have our PowerPoint portion of this lecture here on Protestantism in the United States. And towards the end of this PowerPoint, it'll basically be hitting a couple of snippets of different subjects throughout the 20th century within the United States. So here we go with our PowerPoint. Just some introductory material. The U.S. was spared the devastation and death of World War I, mainly because the war was not fought on U.S. soil. It was fought on the European continent, mainly in France and Belgium. And then also the U.S. joined the war late in the war. It joined in 1917. The war had been going on for a couple of years, and a lot of people, soldiers had died already in Europe before the United States even got involved in World War I. And so there was a lot of death and devastation, but the United States was basically spared all of that. And most churches supported a kind of isolationist movement, stay out of the war, peace movement until 1916, when it was clear that there was just a complete bloodletting going on in Europe, and the churches basically saw that they needed to step in, and there was a need to save civilization. So the churches got behind the war movement, especially after the United States got involved in the war. And there's just a soldier there that had been in the no man's land for quite some time, because you can see he's very deteriorated. But the war is over, and the Allies win World War I, and we move into the decade of the 1920s. And during the 1920s, there was, again, another focus on isolationism, where the United States is just going to stay to itself and focus on itself. And there was a lot of social revolutions going on. If you think of the Roaring Twenties, and just different things going on with women's rights and loose morality within the country and within society. But on the global scale, there was this focus on being against the communists. There was this event that takes place in the United States called the Red Scare, and that is basically the United States wanted to get rid of any communists in the government and in society, and most of the time they were just kicked out of the country or deported to a communist country, and it's called the Red Scare. And many churches saw themselves as a defense against the communists. Now we have to remember that communism is rooted in Marxism, and Marxism is inherently atheistic. And so the United States did not want anything to do with the communists. And so there's a political cartoon on the right that says, "Come unto me, ye oppressed," with the Statue of Liberty looking towards Europe. But you see the guy behind, it says European anarchist, which the communists were viewed as anarchists, behind her with the bomb and a knife coming up behind. And that's representation of the communists that are already in the United States. And so even though they were isolationists, the United States wanted to maintain a front against the communists. Also in the 1920s, there was a focus on evolution, and this became a focal point between the liberal Christians, who said that there were errors in Scripture, and then the fundamentalists, who said they were conservatives, and they said that the Christians need to get back and focus on the fundamentals of the faith and the basic doctrines of the faith. And the liberals sided with evolution, and the fundamentals sided against evolution. And so it really came to a head at the Scopes trials in 1925. And in the Scopes trials, it really brought evolution to the forefront, and it became almost like a national phenomenon, or definitely the whole nation was focused on it. And it was when John T. Scopes, who was a Tennessee high school science teacher, he was accused of teaching evolution in the public school, and that was in violation of what is called the Butler Act, that it was illegal to teach evolution. that he was there doing it. So he was brought up on charges, and it went on for a good number of days. And it was a hot summer in Tennessee, and it was not a very good trial, especially for the prosecution. The prosecution team included William Jennings Bryan, who was a failed presidential candidate, and he was also a lawyer. Well, he was also a fundamentalist, and so he was on the prosecution side, and he did not do well as a prosecutor in this case, and really did not help the cause for the anti-evolutionists. And so, although John T. Scopes was found guilty, he was actually found guilty and fined $100. That's all it was that came out of this. It pushed evolution to the forefront in schools, and really it pushed it to evolution being accepted, that it should be allowed to be taught in public schools. And so you can see there on the right there was an anti-evolution league in that picture. There was different groups, societies that would fight for evolution or fight against evolution. This one here is fighting against evolution. And it says the conflict, hell or high school. So on that sign, it's basically saying that evolution is going to lead people to hell. And it was a national phenomenon where how the whole country got interested in this topic. Another thing that takes place in the 1920s is prohibition. Prohibition was where the law made it illegal to make and sell alcohol, and the liberals jumped on this bandwagon because they saw it as a platform for initiating more social gospel, and the conservatives jumped on the bandwagon to return the country to a purer time. And so even though liberals and conservative Christians were both in support of prohibition and getting rid of the alcohol, it was for different reasons. And in the end, there was an amendment to the Constitution that made alcohol illegal, and then had to be re-amended when it was made legal again, because it all did was drive the sale and making and sale of alcohol underground and made a black market for it. So obviously it did not work, and prohibition was overturned. But it was a big deal in the 1920s. And you see on the right-hand side there, principles of the Prohibition Party. And right here in the background is the church. So it says the situation, or here you can see it says prison down here on the bottom, prison. So there's a gravestone there. So this is the situation they're in with alcohol, and the desire is to be up here. And the church was a focal point on the Prohibition movement. And you can see right here it says Sunday school on this little church building. So the Prohibitionists definitely were involved and getting the church involved in the fight against alcohol. Okay, so the Great Depression of the 1930s. On October 24th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, and it continued to tumble for several years, and this really affected the United States. And it was actually a global depression, but the United States was definitely hit hard. A quarter of the U.S. workforce lost their jobs. Banks were out of money. Bankrupted businesses. Poverty gripped the United States, and so you see the common picture, or the pictures of the common activity of standing in going to soup kitchens and standing in bread lines and looking for jobs and unemployed. And really, what happened was the 1920s was a time of optimism, and after the war, and now this completely stopped all optimism. The mainline denominations, especially Methodists, called for the government to get involved and help the people, and Christian fundamentalists said that it was socialism and accused the mainline denominations of being communists. So the Methodists wanted the government to help, but when the government reaches into society like that, the Christian fundamentalists said that it would lead to socialism. So what did the liberals want? The liberals wanted Social Security, unemployment insurance, antitrust laws, and what happens is President Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, he initiated his New Deal, which basically was a big program of socialist programs. So these socialist programs that he initiated did help to bring the United States out of the Great Depression, but really it was a very socialistic um, government that was being established under FDR. But what really brought the United States out of the Great Depression was World War II, which towards the end of the 1930s was beginning to ramp up, and then in 1939 was the actual start of the war. Okay, so the 1940s, the war had been raging in Europe for 2 years before the United States got involved. And on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese Empire. So the United States declared war on Japan, and the next day, Germany declared war on the United States. So uh, we ended up going into war on two theaters, the European theater and the Pacific theater. Well, churches, they got behind the war effort almost immediately. There was a massive call up of troops. So many men went to join up and fight. So many Christians did go off to fight the war. So the churches were behind them. Many denominations provided chaplains for the armed forces. And so there's a picture there of a chaplain in the European theater, and he's holding a church service outside. He even has a little traveling organ that this guy down here is was playing, and they're obviously in prayer in that picture. The U.S. churches were horrified by the Nazis' atrocities, so they, again, getting behind the war to stop this. And in the end, the Allies win the war, and it ushers in a time of prosperity, which is going to affect the family and churches and the nation as a whole. So before we get to those topics, right after World War II, we enter into what is called the Cold War, which is basically a war where no the main combatants, meaning the United States and the USSR, did not go to war, but just had their missiles pointed at each other. Of course, there were other wars that took place, and with the backing of these entities, you had the United States in getting involved in Korea and in Vietnam, and the USSR, obviously the communist governments backing North Korea and North Vietnam. So we have what is called the Cold War, and which is also called the nuclear age. And what it is, it's a time period where the possibility was there for humanity to kill itself on a global scale with massive annihilation of people. And this would come through a nuclear holocaust, where basically missiles could be shot by both sides, and the missiles could land in pretty much any part of the globe and just bring down a complete waste on the land, killing everyone in the land where the nuclear missile would have hit. And really what it was the free West, meaning the Western European nations that were free, and the United States, which the United States was pretty much the leader in the Cold War, versus the USSR and the communist bloc nations. And again, like I just said, the communist nations, we have to remember that for the most part, communists are basically Marxists, and Marxists are atheistic. So really, in communist nations, there's no freedom of religion. And it lasted until 1989, and when the Berlin Wall fell, and then 1991, the USSR falls, and it's no longer a communist country; it becomes a democracy in 1991. And you see there in the picture, that's atomic bomb Gilda being tested in 1946 on the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. So the nuclear age brought a clamp down on religion in these communist countries. So here's a picture on the left of Germany. This is Berlin, Germany, where you have the Berlin Wall separating East and West Berlin, and East Berlin being communist, West Berlin being free, and the Berlin Wall became a symbol of the communist regime and basically of how evil communism is. And then over on the right-hand side of the screen, you have Russia, which is this is the USSR, and then these are the communist bloc countries. And why they're called communist bloc countries is because they're not part of these pink ones are not part of the USSR, but they are heavily influenced, and they are communist countries. And they block USSR from free Europe. And so you have Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Romania, People's Republic of Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania. So these are all communist countries heavily influenced by the USSR. And then these red ones actually become annexed into the USSR later on. So anyway, it's just this was all under communist rule. So after World War II, we have another phenomenon in the United States called the baby boomers. After World War II, millions of servicemen came home, they got married, and they started their families, which caused a huge increase in the population. And so new homes were needed and suburbs were built across the nation. It was not anymore where a lot of people lived in the cities. A lot of people had started moving out of the cities, and suburbs were built where you had these houses with their basically communities, as their own communities popped up, living areas with houses, and there was grocery stores and churches and everything you would need for a community was built on the outskirts of the city. And so there was high production and it was a high economy. It was a really good time or a high time in the United States. And there's just a picture of a family. So this would be basically like the dad. He was a soldier in World War II, came home, got married to mom. A couple years later, they have the kids, and now it's time to move into their house with their car, and they will be living out in the suburbs. And these children would be called the baby boomers. So in the inner cities, as the suburbs exploded in growth, inner cities were abandoned. So basically what happens is as the people and the wealth really started concentrating on the suburbs, churches moved out into the suburbs. They abandoned the inner city. Also, Christianity was becoming rooted in the comfortable suburbs as poverty and crime was rooted in the inner city. And what I mean by the comfortable suburbs is that in the suburbs, people were able to have a little bit more land. They were allowed to, they weren't constrained by the urban environment. They were more in a suburban environment. So this would go on for decades, several decades, and the cities became deplorable until finally in the 1980s, churches started to see a need to get back into the cities because the cities were just deplorable and they couldn't ignore it anymore. Here's a picture of in 1976 of the Bronx, New York. I mean, you can just see how just bad it is. And if you know anything about New York City history, I lived outside of New York City for some time, and I'm from New York, upstate New York. Basically, in the 1970s, almost all of the Bronx burned down. It was just terrible. Abandoned buildings, abandoned apartment buildings. They turned into drug dens, and before you know it, the entire city, the entire borough of New York City in the Bronx was just a complete wasteland. And it happened in Brooklyn. It happened in Queens, and even in like Harlem. These areas of New York City were just terrible. Because there was no focus on anything in the city, just ran right into the ground. But out in the suburbs, things were different, and churches grew rapidly. In the 1950s and 60s, churches were built across the nation to meet the needs of these baby boomer families. As mom and dad were raising the kids in the suburbs, and there were churches, they took kids to churches, and these communities. They were centered, these suburban communities centered around what you would think of as a community. So the grocery store, the school, the park, and obviously churches. And what happens is during the 1950s and 60s, a new church architecture sprang up, and there was a big boom in building churches in the 1950s and 60s. And a lot of times you can even tell just by the architecture of when they were built in 1950s and 60s. So it's nice, beautiful sanctuaries, fellowship halls were built, education wings were built, and Christian schools were built. And so the churches really grew rapidly across the country. Also during the 20th century was the Billy Graham Crusade, which lasted a long time because he lived a long time. And it began in the 1950s when he was preaching for Campus Crusade for Christ. And you see his dates there, 1918 to 2018, so he was almost 100 years old when he died. But Campus Crusade for Christ, he was going on college campuses and preaching, and he became a worldwide evangelist. And his evangelistic association scheduled revivals all around the world for decades and decades and decades. So he basically rooted it or modeled it after the old-time revivals. And although conservative, he broke down denominational walls. And some people criticize him for this, but he broke down denominational walls, and numerous people were saved in the revivals that lasted decades. On the left is the LA Coliseum in 1963, so you can just see that it was just a packed out house. So here's the stage down here in the middle on the field, on the football field. And there's a picture of Billy Graham preaching. And then also we'll just finish up with the civil rights movement. The NAACP was founded in 1909, and that fought for civil rights of blacks, especially after World War II. And then they were joined by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which was founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And many of the men in NAACP and also in the SCLC were prominent men in the civil rights movement, but they were also usually men in ministry, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a reverend, he was a pastor. Much of the movement found its rooting in the Christian faith of the black community. And it also kind of had this flavor of what is called the old spirituals. And the old spirituals were basically a social movement, religious movement on the plantations in defiance of the slave masters. And a lot of times the old spirituals, they'll have songs. They will sing songs to promote their theology and all of that. But that was back in the 19th century when slavery was still around. Well, under the civil rights movement, it regained a new meaning, and the civil rights movement was like the old spirituals, and this was defiance against segregation. So the old spirituals originally was on the plantations against slave masters, and now it was this idea of defiance against segregation in our country. Many black denominations and congregations did find strength in the movement. And here's a picture of a civil rights march with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. there in the center and other men in the march. And that's going to be it for our talk on Protestantism in the United States. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for the PowerPoint. Next time, we're going to be looking at the SBC deterioration of the middle of the 20th century, and then taking a look at the conservative resurgence of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979. See you next time.